guest, Dr. Kastner. So Dr. Kastner is a neuroscientist who studies the science behind visual understanding, attention, and awareness as a professor at Princeton University. She does this through analyzing pictures of human and monkey brains and examining the electrical signals of their neurons. Welcome, Dr. Kastner.
So, firstly, what is your job?
That's a great question. So do you want to know what a scientist does? So I basically have not only one profession, but in a sense I have more. So than one. I'm a professional scientist. That means that I do research. I have a laboratory with, a group of about 10 to 12 young scientists, graduate students, and students who have graduated, but then they undergo further training. It's called postdoctoral training. So after your graduate studies, you do that typically for a few years before you then become a professional scientist and run your own research program and what you're interested in yourself. So you're basically studying, with a more experienced scientist like myself. So that is a big part of my work. We do this work in many, many places around the world, actually. So I work with hospitals in the United States where we, for instance, look at the brains of patients who suffer from epilepsy. I don't know if you have covered this in this amazing course that Ellie put together, but epilepsy means that the electrical signals in the brain get basically out of hand, and then people get unconscious, and sometimes they also get very stiff muscle cramps and so on. So I study those patients. That's one of my interests, and then I do a lot of work also here in Princeton. I take pictures of people's brains, kids. We have a big program where we look at the development of vision. We look at the development of what's called attention function. That is how well you can focus and, basically not get distracted by other things that you would like to do, but you cannot do because your teacher tries to, teach you something. So these are the kinds of things that we are interested in, and we often study the brains of our kids and also of adults by putting them into a magnetic resonance imaging scanner. That's what it's called. Like, it looks like a gigantic donut. And what that donut can do is actually take some very sophisticated pictures of the brain and tell us which regions are activated. So when neurons fire, they need a lot of glucose, of sugar, and we can actually visualize that, and then we can track which regions in the brain are doing which things when we are thinking, or when we are looking at faces, or when we are bored, and so on and so forth. So we can do some fun things with that. So that's a little bit what I do as a scientist. But I'm also a teacher. I'm a college professor, so I teach courses in neuroscience typically because I'm a neuroscientist. So I teach mainly about what's called cognitive neuroscience. So that is what's going on in the brain when we are talking, when we are thinking, when we are seeing something, when we are listening to music, when we are doing movements, and so on and so forth. So I teach very broadly at Princeton on all of these topics, and that's a big part of my time as well. And then I also try to help what's called with administration. So I serve on committees. A university, any big university or any school actually needs basically people who also kind of set rules and regulations of how the whole operation will work and so on, and I help with that a little bit too. So you see, I have three professions in one.
Mm-hmm. I also have a few more questions. What about neuroscience do you find interesting?
I just fell in love with brain science actually very late, much later than you guys. I started to study the brain when I was 22 and I discovered it. And I just never have stopped being fascinated by the brain. I think it is the most sophisticated organ in our body, and in this century, we will make a really, really big stride towards understanding how this organ works. We know very little about it. We are basically, if you think about your lifespan, the neuroscience field right now is basically just born. It's just about 100 years old. And that means, for most scientists that, the science is just born. So we are at very beginning steps to understanding the brain. And I think at the end of the century, we will be just so much further, and it will just be a really, really amazing journey that we will witness. And why I'm so fascinated about the brain, I'm not even sure that I can put that into words, but there's certainly one aspect is that I try to understand my own behavior. How can it be that right now I can communicate with, people who I've never met before, who I'm just meeting right now? We can have this conversation. I can think about this organ that I'm studying. So those are all questions that I find really mysterious. And it's almost like being a detective when you're a scientist. So it's like a brain detective. You really want to try to understand how this works. And it's just never boring. There has not been a single day in my life since I discovered brain science that I would have been bored by what I'm doing. And that's pretty cool, because think about how many boring days you actually spend at school where you're thinking, oh my God, this is really not great today, right? As a brain scientist, I never had a day like that. And I'm really grateful about that, because it keeps me pretty, engaged with everything else in my life.
I have one last question. What made you choose this job?
Um, Well, I was trained to become a professional scientist, and that's what I'm doing right now. So that's just simply my training. I was also trained to become a doctor. So I basically was trained in two professions, but I decided that I wanted to be a professional scientist because I really love to make discoveries. In my lab, we do discoveries every single day. And that's just a wonderful thing, to make a discovery every single day. So that is something that I just find just wonderful. Does this answer all your questions, Kasani?
Yes, I'm good.
Great.
Anushka, go ahead.
Um, I have two questions. My first one is, how long have you been a neuroscientist?
So I have been a neuroscientist now so I started graduate school 32 years ago. And then I had about 10 years or 12 years even of training. So first in graduate school, and then after graduation as a postdoctoral researcher. Um, and after that, I founded my own lab, and I got this job at Princeton University as a professor, and I do that for 20 years. So altogether, a little over 30 years.
Okay. My last question is, how many stroke patients have you ever studied?
Sorry, say it again.
How many stroke patients have you ever studied?
Stroke patients. I actually, when I was trained as a doctor, I did what's called a residency. So that's like a training in neurology, and I actually worked with stroke patients as a doctor for a little while during that training, but I never worked with stroke patients in my research. So I know very little about them. I know a little bit about stroke, but I have not worked a lot with stroke patients.
That's all I have.
All right, well, some people also submitted some questions ahead of time. So someone wants to know, so what tools or like machines do you use in order to do your research? Like what is a normal day in the lab? Like what would you use in order to do your research?
Yeah, so we use a large amount of different machines. So some are pretty large machines like that magnetic resonance imaging scanner that just take we'll take pictures of a human brain, and then we do that while a person is doing some kind of task. So it could be just discover a fearful visual stimulus like a snake or something in a scene that we show, right? So when you do something like that, for instance, since we had this wonderful presentation of Kusani before, who highlighted the amygdala, you will actually see that the amygdala will monitor when you're looking at that snake, because it would still, even though it's just a picture and there's nothing really too fearful here, but it still picks up on that is a potentially threatening stimulus there. So we can do studies like that, and then we can track which regions in the brain are responding to what kind of aspects of what is in front of us. Or, for instance, an experiment that I like a great deal that was just recently done actually by a colleague of mine, but it was done here in Princeton, was that we have several of these machines, and then you could put two people in there and they can interact with each other. So in that particular study, one person told the other person a story, and then we looked at how the brain activations of the storyteller were reflected in the person who was just basically decoding the story. And that was pretty fun. And we did that actually in situations where the two people were communicating. That means they were sharing the same language. But we also did it with somebody who would tell a story in Russian, and the person who was listened to the story doesn't understand Russian, and then to see how different these situations are when the brain cannot decode what somebody else tries to communicate. So you can do studies like that and learn a large amount about language function, for instance, and how that works. And these kind of studies, they take about 2 hours to do. So with one participant, or if you study these kind of simultaneous participants, then it's still only 2 hours, but you have two data sets from two people, and then you repeat that. So let's say you make an observation that's interesting, then you have to make that same observation in another participant. Otherwise, you don't know whether that's just a random thing, and so on. So we collect quite a number of these kinds of data sets, and then we have a lot of sophisticated computer programs to analyze these data, and we often write our own code to analyze these data, and then a lot of time is spent in front of a computer to do this kind of data analysis. And then the final part that's important for scientists is to prepare to communicate these findings that we make, these discoveries. So we spend a lot of time also on writing manuscripts to really think hard about how can we best put these findings together and present them to our colleagues, but then also how to present them in talks that we give to our colleagues. And I do a lot of outreach like this one. So I give a lot of talks to people who do not have a lot of background, not even as much as you acquired during the last weeks about the brain, because I find it important that scientists also try to educate people who are interested in the brain, but who never had the opportunity to study the brain, about what they're finding. And I do a fair amount of that too. So those are kind of the different parts that are involved in science, just to kind of give you one example. But then we also use other machines. So we have also machines that can record. You have learned about electrical activity, I think, from what you presented. So that's basically the currency of the brain. Everything that's coded in the brain is coded in some kind of electrical signals, and we can measure those. We can measure them as electrodes that we simply, put on the skull. That's called an electroencephalogram, or an EEG. So we have a machine like that we can use to measure the electrical activity. We can also do that by implanting electrodes. Some patients sometimes need that for medical purposes, but then we can also record from these electrodes. So we directly record from neurons in the brain. And we can also do that, of course, in animals. And so there are many, many different methods that we use in parallel to get different pieces of information, because the different methods that we use to study the brain often give us different types of information. So there's not one method yet that would give you a full picture of what you want to learn. So we have to use all these different methods to, it's basically looking on let's say on a landscape from different angles. So you will get a different angle if you're looking from standing in front of a mountain than if you are flying over a mountain, in an airplane. So you can think about it that way. And we basically use these different methods to get these different perspectives, and they all tell us something different that we try then we have to piece that together like a puzzle piece, or puzzle pieces of a bigger picture that we try to understand.
Awesome.
Does this answer your question? Sorry. If I get too far astray or too complicated, just stop me.
No, we love hearing more about your work. So someone else wants to know how you know if or how a brain is damaged.
How a brain is?
How would you know if a brain is damaged?
Oh, it's damaged. Sorry, I just didn't get the final word that you said. I understood dead, because that's of course a difference, right? You can also ask that question, right? How do you determine that a person is dead? Actually, right? Because we determine that the brain is dead. That's the ultimate measure that you have to determine that. But let's just not go there. So yeah, a brain damage, again, we are using in medicine as well as in research, mainly these brain imaging tools. So you can basically use those to just look at whether the brain is healthy, and that is how most people, I don't know if anybody of you had a brain scan in your I don't know if you fell off a tree and, had a little bit, a bump to your head, a concussion, and somebody decided you needed the brain scan. So that's what's often done. And so in most cases, we just use that to decide that the brain is actually healthy. And we just look at it, and you get all the beautiful anatomy that you've learned. So you look at all the different lobes, you look at these deep structures like the thalamus, and the brainstem, the cerebellum, make sure that they all look okay. And when you have brain damage, like a stroke or a bleeding in the brain or a brain tumor, then you can use these same methods to make that out relatively easily. So a stroke or a bleeding or a tumor can be typically seen because these images have a really fine resolution. So they have basically a 1 millimeter resolution. If you go below this millimeter and you just have, like, let's say, a small bundle of fibers or accents that have been dissected for some reason, you would not be able to pick that up with these methods. But anything that has a damage that is larger than 1 millimeter can be made out by, a really well-trained radiologist, or even by a very well-trained brain scientist. So, I would be able to look at a lot of those as well and make up that there is damage to this brain. But imaging is everything to determine what that damage is.
Right. Personally, I had a question for you. I know you said that you did a lot of research with children and their attention span. Do you mind elaborating a bit about what you found about children and attention span, and if you found a way for children to be able to increase their attention span?
Yeah, I'll be happy to talk about that. So actually, this started a few years ago when I stumbled into attention deficit disorder. So that was so I basically, my research program uh, is geared towards understanding how attention works in the normal brain, because we understand, again, we are in this baby, steps in this first year of a human lifespan in the neuroscience field. We don't understand how this works, so I try to find out how this function works in the normal brain. But then I stumbled, just working with a few children who suffer from attention deficit disorder. I stumbled into a little bit into that, and I wanted to look more into how we would be able to help them, or how we would use the research that we are producing in the lab to help them. And the first thing that really stood out for me when I did a little bit background research was that no one understands what attention deficit disorder is. And the reason is that no one understands how attention function develops. So I thought, oh, this is cool. Here, I could be really helpful, because I have learned a lot in these 30 years, or more than 30 years, how attention function works in the adult brain. So probably now I can use a lot of what I've learned, and we just look how it normally develops. And that is basically what we're looking at right now. And my hope is that down the road, once we understand the normal development, we can also start to understand the development that may be not so typical. And then we could use that knowledge to hopefully help kids who struggle with attention function. So I want to give you one example, and that's actually something we are studying already. So the way this attention function works is, even when you're focused right now, or many of you, I don't see all of your faces, but at least the faces I see them very focused on me. So you're focused right now, but even when you're focused, there are fluctuations that are very automatic, so you cannot regulate them. So you basically go up and down. So on a moment-by-moment basis, sometimes you can actually take in more information. The next moment you can take less information. And that has to do with how the network in your brain that produces this function is set up. So you can think about it. You have learned about the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe, and those are two lobes that are really engaged during focusing. And what happens is actually that they need to get coordinated, and they need to get coordinated where the parietal cortex is a little bit more active, then the frontal cortex goes down and it goes back. So you can think about it as this kind of seesaw thing, and that produces these kind of modulations. And they are a characteristic for normal function. So there's nothing pathological here, it's just how it works. And we think that it's a hallmark of a normally developed function. And we want to see when this kind of seesaw behavior of that network develops in normal development, and then whether kids who struggle with attention deficit disorder, attention function, whether they actually may not have that seesaw, and it may be one of the roots of why they struggle. And if we would know that, then we could actually try to train the brain to do that seesawing again. And that's what we're working on right now. Because it's not very difficult to entrain a brain to do this again, but we need to understand whether that is an important part of this story and of the puzzle or not.
Do you like your job?
That's a great question. Yes, I love my job. Being a scientist And being a teacher, I teach college students, so they're a little bit older than you, and teaching them about the brain and what I've learned in my life as a scientist about the brain. That's just so much fun. So I can't imagine a better job.
Okay. I have a question. So, why do you use monkeys?
Sorry, say it again.
Why do you use monkeys?
So the monkeys are the closest animals. They have a brain, or their brains are closely related to ours. So and they have also behavior that is closely related to ours. So for instance, if you think about the visual system, vision, you've learned about the occipital lobe. Monkeys have a very, very similar visual system than ours. So for instance, mice or rats, those are also animals that many people study. You probably have heard about this kind of phrase that mice are blind. And they are, basically, because their visual system is very, very poor. So if you want to learn something about our visual system that we have as humans, then that would not be really a good way to learn about that. But from a monkey, you can learn a lot about our own visual system. And so we use this as basically a model that we can study in very detailed ways, in much greater detail than we can study the human brain, really to learn something about our brains. That is our goal there. And monkeys are extremely smart creatures, so they are very, very smart. They're not as smart as we are, but they are probably, coming just as a close second. And many other animals just do not have a great deal of intelligence. So we can also really start to understand intelligent behavior in monkeys that we cannot study in any other animals.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
You said you studied monkeys and humans, right? Like, how do you do it? Like, do you put some machine on them and keep it for a day or something and see how their brain is working? Or do you make a monkey go into some cage and then test them in there? What do you do? How do you do it, or what things would you?
Yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about it. We do many different things, but I will give you a few examples. So one machine that we're using is a very, very big machine. I don't know if any of you have had a brain scan in their lives. So, after sometimes when you go blow to the head, you fall from, some tree or something like that. You may get a brain scan just to make sure that your brain is fine. But we can also use these big brain scanners in research, and that's what we do here at Princeton University. And so you can scan monkey brains as well as human brains, and that's painless. It's just, you go to a scanner for a couple of hours and have your brain scanned. And the interesting things that we can do is we can activate the regions of the brain that are engaged when you're doing a certain thing. So when you're thinking about dinner, or when you are looking at the faces of your best friends, or things like that, or you're watching a movie. So we can do all kinds of things. One of my favorite examples is actually a study that was done where they put two people into two scanners, but they could talk to each other. So they had, like a computer interface, just what we do right now, some kind of interface where they could talk to each other. And one person was telling the other one a story, just like the great stories that you did. And so one person was telling the story and the other one was listening. And what people simply studied was how the brain activity of the person who was telling the story was different from the person who was, decoding that story and trying to understand that story. So you can do incredibly interesting studies like that and learn a great deal about language function, for instance, there. So monkeys do not talk. So language is one of those functions that we cannot study in monkeys, but we can study, many, many other things in them. Now, the scanner is one example. Another thing that we do is we can also record from single neurons. So you have learned about neurons. You have, I think, also learned that these neurons communicate through electrical signals that they send out. And we can measure these electrical signals directly. So the way we do that, and we do that in monkeys, is we put a thin wire into their brain. We can do that because the brain does not have any receptors that signal pain. So this is completely painless. It's not that, we do anything horrible there. And then we can directly pick out those electrical signals from single neurons in the brain. That is a very, exciting thing to do. When I was a graduate student and I did that for the first time, it was just like the brain was talking to me through these electrical signals that I try to understand. And it's an incredible experience you can also listen to them, so you can basically just put them through a loudspeaker and you hear every single electrical impulse that is produced by a neuron, and it's just an incredible experience to experience how a brain is functioning, basically. And that's what we try to understand. So that's another method. And then you also asked whether they live in cages, but we have also kind of big enclosures for them. They live a little bit like in a zoo-like environment. And we also do studies, for instance, when they're sleeping. So we are interested in understanding how the brain works during sleep. That's one of our projects. And for that, we just, record this brain activity while they are in their cages and sleeping and resting. So those are, we have very, very different approaches to learn something about the brain. It depends on what we want to learn. Very good question, actually.
Right, someone asked in the chat, if your brain is damaged, how long does it take?
When your brain is damaged, actually, my internet is a little bit stable and I may go in and out. Let me just switch real quick to another one. It takes just 2 seconds, but I will basically probably freeze for 2 seconds. Let me just do that real quick. Okay, now I should be back. So you asked how long it takes for brain damage to recover. Was that the question? So it really depends on the how much brain damage there is. And that is kind of, I think you can think about that. That's very intuitive, right? If you have very large portions of the brain damaged, that's, worse than if you have only like a small damage somewhere in the brain. Let's say, I want to give you a concrete example because I think it's better to talk about a concrete example. Have you learned about stroke? What a stroke is? I think so, right? So if somebody has a stroke, let's say a stroke to the temporal lobe in your left brain. I don't know if you have learned that, but that is the lobe that in the left side of your brain that has language function. So if somebody has a stroke there and that part of the brain gets damaged, then there will be a deficit in producing language and probably also in understanding what other people try to tell you, so in comprehending language. After that stroke, if that person practices a lot, the brain is all about practice. So that's actually something that you need to take. If you hate math and you think, I can't learn math, yes, you can learn math. You just have to train your math brain and eventually you will get there. So the brain is all about wanting to learn. And after a stroke, a person just has to do a whole lot more to basically retrain um, his or her own brain. And it takes typically about a year to get some of that function back. Not all the function may come back. There may be, still be a little bit of a deficit after that, something that doesn't quite work well. But very often a lot of function can come back during that 1 year, but only if you practice. That is very, very important. So it's not coming back just by itself. It takes a lot of work to do that. And that is something you should keep in mind, because people often give up and they are frustrated if they cannot learn something very quickly. You can learn everything you want in your lifetime. You just have to give it time and keep on practicing, and then your brain will learn. That's the magical thing about the brain. It's a great learner, and it will always it wants to continue learning through your entire lifetime. It will never stop if you don't want it to stop. If you stop learning, then it will not learn anymore. But as long as you learn through your life, you can basically get better and better at something, which I think is just fascinating. Okay.
Yeah, so we have another question. How did you get interested in studying and teaching and researching neuroscience?
So in college, what I studied initially was actually very different. When I was graduating from high school, I wanted to study mathematics. Actually, I wanted to become a mathematician. And people at the time discouraged me to do that because it was very unusual for a woman to become a mathematician. And they said I would not have a career as a mathematician, so I should study something else. And so the first things I studied were just things I was really interested in. Since I couldn't study math, I studied history and philosophy. And I got my bachelor degree, so my college degree is in history and philosophy. And then through philosophy, I found all these questions about the brain. So it was just like, why can I reason? Why can I, think in so sophisticated ways? Why can I use my hands and my brain to build tools? All those kinds of things that only people can do. I found that just very, very fascinating. And then I was very fortunate that I attended a lecture by a famous neuroscientist at the time, and he was later on my mentor. And he just introduced me to brain science and basically showed me that I would be able, as a neuroscientist, as a brain scientist, to study a lot of these questions directly. Philosophers think about these questions, but I could just do experiments to address them and collect data and analyze data and so on and so forth and make real discoveries. And I just loved that idea. And that was my original motivation to become a brain scientist. And once I got into neuroscience and I, it's just kind of sucked me in there, and I never, would leave this field. It's just the most fascinating science that I can think of. But science in general is fascinating. So whatever you find interesting, you should follow. Any science is interesting, but my science is brain science.
I think a common question is, what is a day in the life of a neuroscientist? Or a day in the life for you? Because obviously every neuroscientist has a different set of research and teaching and everything, but what is it like for you?
Yeah, so a typical life for me is a little bit of all of this. Typically I spend some time in my laboratory. So I have a lot of young colleagues who study with me. These are students who are in graduate school. They're also undergraduate students at Princeton who work in our laboratories. And then I have people who have a degree in neuroscience, but they get specialized training. These are so-called postdoctoral researchers. I have a whole group of them, about 12 people, with whom I work with, and everybody's doing an interesting project and discovers things. And so very often I will spend, time with my people, either discussing things, or I will sit in when they're doing experiments, because I still love to just, see what the experiments are like. I will help them with, things they're struggling with in their studies. So that is a portion of my day, and then another portion will be to probably give a lecture to my undergraduate students and teach exclusively neuroscience topics. Um, Probably to meet with a few of my students to discuss projects, writing projects that they are working on. So mentorship is a big part of being a college professor. Then I do things like I do right now. I do a lot of outreach. So I may go to school and, do some kind of outreach project about the brain. Um, I travel a lot. So as a scientist, many scientists are traveling a lot. So I go to places where people invite me and want to learn more about my science, and I give talks and talk to colleagues. So those are the kinds of activities that I do. It's a very interesting life because there's almost no day like the next. I mean, right now in this pandemic, every day feels a little bit like the next, and I'm sure that's true for you too. But in my normal professional life, there are lots and lots of, different activities. And since we do a lot of studies and they change all the time, you learn every day something new about the brain. So it feels like it's never boring. It's always something interesting going on, and we make discoveries. We learn something that no one has ever learned before us, and that's just very, very exciting. I hope that gives you some kind of idea about my life.
Anyone else have any questions for Dr. Kastner? Another question that someone submitted was, what is your favorite part of being a neuroscientist?
I think there are two favorite parts I have. One is making discoveries and learning every day. I'm kind of, when you're a scientist, you're a lifelong learner. That's kind of part of it. And many people, I think, who love to learn, and I loved to learn when I was in school. So that's kind of where my love for learning starts. And then I think it's a big thing for me as a scientist that will never stop. As long as I'm a professional scientist, I will have this opportunity to learn and to make discoveries. So that's a big part. And the other part that I really like the most is to train young scientists to, I love to have the young next generation of scientists in my lab, and to help them get their careers going. And that's just something that I find just wonderful, that I have so many, wonderful young people, and I'm able to help them a little bit to their next steps.
All right, so kind of just a final question, I guess. I know you've given everyone a lot of advice about continuing to learn and practicing, but is there any one specific piece of advice that you would give all of these young people who are really interested in neuroscience, advice about pursuing a career in science, continuing to follow their passions, anything like that?
So I would advise you to take as many opportunities as the ones that you just took here. There's wonderful opportunity that Ellie opened up for you to learn about the brain, the reign of the brain. I love the title. um, and just to really try out a lot of different things and really see if you find something that speaks to you. And once you find that, I think it can become a passion. If you want to become a scientist, you have to be very passionate about your science. Otherwise, you will not be successful in what you're doing. And so it's really important to find that field of science that really, really interests you, whether it's, brain science or I don't know, genetics. My son wants to become a paleontology because he loves dinosaurs from when he was 3 years old, and now he's 13 and he still loves dinosaurs. And he wants to become a paleontologist. And I think it's great because he found a science that just speaks to him. And so I think that's important, but you can only find that if you try out a lot of things. So I have one pointer for you. I gave this also to the other group I spoke to with Ellie today. I have founded a science journal for kids. It's actually kids your age and then a little older. So it's for, like 8 to 14-year-old kids. And it's free, it's online. It's called Frontiers for Young Minds. And right now there are 6 different areas of science, but there will be more in the coming years. So we will add to this. And you can learn about all kinds of interesting science there. It's scientists who are writing their own science as, it comes basically out of their laboratories up for kids. And you just could look around there and really see what interests you. And I think there are other outlets like that you will find where you can really learn a lot about science and probably really find an interest that's very special.
Yeah.
That's my advice. And then just follow your heart. Put your heart in there and follow that interest that you develop, and that may give you a path into science.
She wants to know what it's like to study neurons.
What it's like to study neurons. That's probably the most exciting thing that a neuroscientist can do. So one of the things, or one of the ways in which we can study neurons is by recording the electrical activity that they produce. And that can be done just, in a brain that works. So one way to do that is to use a very thin wire and to put that into the brain of a rodent, a mouse, or a monkey, and to see what kind of activity a neuron produces while the mouse is running around in a little maze that we made for them, or while a monkey looks at pictures of other monkeys, for instance. These are examples for the kinds of studies you could do. And what the neuron will do is, and you've learned a little bit about that, I think it will produce electrical activity. So it will basically fire a train of electrical signals, and we can record those. We can even listen to them by amplifying these signals and put them on loudspeakers. And so you can basically just sit in a room and listen to what neurons are doing, and then imagining what's going on in your own brain. So that is, one pretty cool example. The reason why we can do that is, it sounds a little bit probably scary when I tell you that we can put wires into brains, but the brain does not have any receptor that can signal pain. So, we have that in our skin when we, cut or hurt ourselves, but the brain doesn't have that. So this is why we can do, for instance, brain surgery in people while they're awake, which is typically done actually. So that's a pretty remarkable feature of the brain. Does this answer a little bit your question?
Julia's not here. She's from the other session.
Oh, I see.
I'm
Okay.
sure that answered her question. Another person wanted to know what kind of machines are you able to use to do your research?
So I just talked about these wires that can record electrical activity. In humans, we can also record electrical activity with little electrodes. These look like little metal plates that we put directly, on the skin here over the brain, basically over the entire skull. And so we can, measure activity from a lot of neurons, so probably, I don't know, 10 or 20,000. So these are not very, or these are just signals that basically sum up, a lot of input from lots and lots of neurons, but you can do that too. And that machine is called an electroencephalogram. And it was discovered that you could do that. And this machine was basically built about 100 years ago by a German named Hans Berger. And he introduced that. So that's a method that's still used in clinical practice very much, and also in research. And that method is about 100 years old. And when I just got out of graduate school, which was about 30 years ago, there was another method introduced that was very exciting. And this method now is used a lot. And at that time, brain scanners were introduced where you could put a person in and scan activity that is produced by their brains. This is not painful. This is also not dangerous or anything. One can do this repeatedly. The only thing you need to do is basically you need to be very still, because these machines do not like head motion very much. But brain scanners are probably the most prominent way to study the human brain. And we have at Princeton University two of these brain scanners. They have a very high magnetic field. They look like a gigantic donut. And so we have for our research here two of these machines. So that gives you some, examples of the kind of machines that we are using to study the brain. The most important thing is when we study humans to keep our human participants safe and not expose them to, radiation or things like that, which, could be dangerous. So all of these methods are very safe and, do not present a health risk or something like that. So it's really, a good and fun way to study the human brain with these kinds of machines.
Another student had sent in a question and wanted to know, how did you end up becoming a neuroscientist, and how did you end up doing the work that you're doing now?
So I became a scientist relatively late. So I was not so much interested in biological sciences when I was in school, and throughout my school life, actually. My interests when I was in school, particularly during the last years in high school, were history, philosophy, and mathematics. And I wanted to study mathematics coming out of school, but I was told that that was not a good career for a female, just because I'm a woman. They said to me, there are too many men in that field, and you will have a hard time being accepted there. And so I studied history and philosophy. Those were the other things I was really into. And I then discovered, through philosophy, I discovered the brain and how interesting it is. And that one can actually study it by designing experiments. using all these machines and tools to really get insight into what the brain is doing. And that was just kind of an amazing discovery for me. And then I switched. I was about 22 years old. I completely, switched my career. I left my history studies and switched over to actually study medicine so that I could go into a biological field and then do a doctorate, so what we call a PhD degree in neuroscience. And how I got into the things that I have studied for, 25 years or so, I think those things always depend a little bit on whom you meet and who influences you. So I was very lucky to have a number of really wonderful mentors, and I think they kind of shaped my thinking and my directions a great deal when I was a young scientist. And then I just picked up what I found interesting and continued that. And over the years, I have also added, new interests to that. So I tell you about one interest that I have really been fascinated with, and that is the machinery that we have in our brain to build tools, sophisticated tools, because that is something that very few animals are doing in the animal kingdom. And no one can do as sophisticated as humans. And we have a whole specialized machinery in our brain that helps us, have this ability. And that is in studying and learning about, just to give you one example. But I think, the reason why I study what I study is that I think I got into these topics, vision and how we focus, how we attend to information and that's around us, that interests us. I got into those topics very early on, and I just found them interesting, and they have never left me. But I could have gotten into a whole cohort of other things. I'm sure I would have been just as thrilled about. The amazing thing about the brain is that you can find a really indefinite number of thrilling and interesting topics. It is just an area of science where you will never ever get bored. And so it's a good place to be if you're interested in the brain.
Another question that was submitted is, what is it like to be a professor of neuroscience?
So is this a question what I do as a professor of neuroscience, basically?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay. So what you do as a college professor is basically, so I have, 2 or 3 professions, if you like. So one thing I do is I do my research. That's a very big part of my time. So I have about 10 to 12 young scientists in my lab typically. And then we have, in addition to that, also a few college students who work with us. So it's a nice group of young scientists, and my role is to help them doing their own experiments and to mentor them in that. So I have a little bit more experience because I'm just in this field for a longer time. So that can be helpful for them when they, start doing their own studies and their own experiments. So I spend a lot of time talking to my students, sitting in when they do experiments. I was actually earlier today in my lab and did that all day long, and that's actually my favorite. I love that. And just observe basically how they do the experiments, and then also I can, sometimes make suggestions on what they could do differently or to try out new things and so on. But the other parts that are also really important for a scientist is to not only to think about doing new experiments and doing new discoveries, but you also need to write up the new discoveries. it's basically you have a story in your mind and you need to write it up, right? Otherwise the story will never get out there and it will never get shared with other people. So that's the same for a scientist. And we spend a lot of time writing up our discoveries to share them with our colleagues and also to share them very often with, with the public, with people who are not necessarily educated in science. Um, and then the second part, the second profession that I have, if you like, is that of a teacher. So you know what your teachers are doing in school. You are younger students. Later on, when you go to high school, a lot of what your teachers will do is they will lecture. So they will tell you about a bunch of things, and then you will get assignments to um, to apply what you have learned from these talks and these lectures, and that's what I do. Just not teaching high school students, but I teach college students, and I teach only neuroscience, so that's just my specialty. Um, and I travel a fair amount and give talks to the public as well as to my colleagues. So traveling, not right now, obviously, but typically when we are not in a COVID pandemic is a very big part too. It's very important to basically get those discoveries out there, and there are many ways to do that. One is just to publish articles that you write, but another one is also to give talks at scientific conferences or to visits at universities. So those are, the kinds of activities that I do in my professional life as a professor of neuroscience.
Do you mind talking a bit about some of the projects that you are overseeing that you think are really interesting?
So, yeah, I can tell you about a few of the projects that we have done over the years. So I talked a little bit about tool making. Actually, you have learned about the parietal lobe during the last few weeks, and the tool making network is has very prominent parts in the parietal cortex, actually. Um, and and that part of the brain, the parietal cortex or parietal lobe, is a part that I have studied over many, many years now. So about for the last 15 years, we studied that part of the brain in humans because it turns out that it is very, very different than in other primates. That has to do with the fact that we have these networks that are related to human-specific behavior and tool making, or at least sophisticated tool making is one of that. So we have looked into this part of the brain to understand what these networks, what kind of input these networks need, what kind of information these networks need in order to be able to, to think out new and invent new tools and things like that. Another thing that I have worked on for a long time is actually to map out and determine the human visual system. The human visual system, as you have learned, is mainly in the occipital lobe, but also in the temporal lobe, in this more inferior part, the lower part of the temporal lobe, and these lobes and the visual system within it are very structured. So they are about 30 or 35. We don't even know at this point how many areas there are, but there are many, many different areas. And we basically use these imaging methods that I talked about before, where we put people into these big donut scanners and take images from their brain to determine what each of these areas are, and also to get a good idea about what these areas might do. And that has been a big part of my work. And then another example that I want to give you is the work on visual attention that we do. What that means is our ability to focus. So right now, I cannot see all of you, but probably if you're looking at this screen, you're focusing on me right now, and you're listening to what I tell you. And you can do that even though there are many, many things around you that may be distractors. You know, you may want to, I don't know, eat an ice cream in 5 minutes or so, and you have to suppress that idea that, you know, go to the freezer and get your ice cream because you still want to listen to me. And so this ability to focus is very, very important for people, and especially for students in school. It is really, really important that you are able to, you know, focus on what your teacher tries to tell you and to follow instructions. And when you're, you know, very distracted all the time and you cannot do that very well, then often, you know, students can struggle a lot. And so we try to understand what the brain mechanisms are that afford us this ability to focus, and what happens also when this ability is weak, because we also would like to use that knowledge to help kids who struggle with focus. So that has been a very, very big you know, thing, I think, for my entire career to try to understand that.
Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Kastner? Not, we have more, but I just want to make sure that you all are able to ask any that you have. All right, you can always ask them. But another question we had was someone who was in a previous session but wanted to ask another question. They wanted to know, when you take images from people's brains, what are you looking for in those images?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So in images that we take from the brain, we cannot look at electrical activity. What we are looking at is basically a metabolic signal. So when a brain region gets activated, let's say right now I'm talking, so my language centers will be very activated right now. They need more glucose or sugar. And you will see a metabolic, you can measure a metabolic signal that's basically related to that. And that is oxygen. So oxygen will flow, more oxygenated blood will flow more into these regions that you need, so that the glucose, the sugar metabolism, gets increased there. And it's very specific to those regions that are mostly activated when you do a certain task, like, you know, speaking right now and using my language centers. And that is what we can pick up in these images. So this is basically what we measure. Indirectly, this is also related to the neural activity, because when, you know, you use these regions, you produce a lot of electrical activity, and that again will need, you know, more oxygen and more glucose. And that is what we basically then measure in our in these imaging methods that we are using. So it's not a direct electrical signal, it's an indirect signal, but it's a very specific signal that we pick up there.
Another question that came up is, what is your favorite thing to teach your students about?
So since I have a background in medicine, I like to teach, even though that's not what I'm studying, but I like to teach topics that are related to medicine. That has simply to do with the fact that a lot of the students that I teach here at Princeton are so-called pre-meds. So they take a lot of courses that they will need so that they can later on apply to medical school. So they basically want to become medical doctors. And they are very interested in topics of medicine that, you know, are related to neuroscience. So one of my favorite topics is to teach about what happens when certain brain regions get damaged. So for instance, if a person, I think you learned about stroke, I believe, or right, you have covered that a little bit. So when somebody, for instance, has a stroke in a certain part of the brain, and then as a consequence of that stroke has a behavioral deficit. It could be a motor deficit, it could be a deficit in producing language. It could be a deficit in being blind. I mean, there are lots and lots of different, you know, consequences depending on which brain region gets damaged that could happen. And I teach a course that basically goes very systematically to a lot of the major lesion sites that you know, are described in medicine, and discuss the behavior and the deficits that people have, and how we can recover those. So how function can get recovered, but also what to do to help people recover that function, because there's a lot that can be done. And actually our neuroscience research and what we know about the brain can help, you know, inform doctors about what might be the best strategies to get function that was initially lost after stroke or some other brain damage, to get that back. And that class is really interesting to teach for me. I often learn a lot from that class, because it's not really what I do in my research. So it's for me a lot of a wonderful opportunity to learn things for myself that I didn't know about the brain before in preparing for my teaching. And the students typically are really very interested in these topics, because it is often much easier to learn about the brain. The brain, or brain science, can get very complex, you know, at some level. But if you can combine it to real case studies that involve a human being, it's often much, much easier to learn about brain science. So I think my students often like this kind of link to very concrete people and cases that we go through in, you know, getting into these more complex matters.
One question about the monkeys that you work with. So what is the difference, like, how do you deal with studying a human brain versus studying a monkey brain?
Well, monkeys in the first place are a different species. Uh, so it's, you know, monkeys and humans are very different, or have a lot of differences. The main reason why we use monkeys in brain research, and why monkeys are really, really important in brain research, is that it's the only species that we can study that is very, very close to our own brains. So the next species typically that is studied, or the next animal, are mice. And as you may imagine, I mean, you know, mice, the differences between mice and humans are vast. So that gives us really an opportunity, studying monkeys, to study a brain that's much, much closer to our own brains. So, you know, we have very similar structures in terms of the lobes. The visual system is very similar in monkeys as compared to humans. So mice, for instance, do not have a good visual system. You may have heard about this phrase that mice are blind, and they are pretty blind, actually. Whereas, you know, monkeys have basically a visual system that's almost identical to ours. So if you are a vision scientist like myself, that's really the species you want to study. So what we can do in monkeys that we cannot do in people is very often to really record from regions that we would never be able to gain insight from in a human with any of these many, many tools that we have available for human brain research. And that is basically the reason why we're using monkeys. So most of the very detailed models, for instance, that we have, about how the brain works all come from monkey research, because the tools that we have in humans are not precise enough. They're too coarse to give us really that kind of detailed insight that we need if we, for instance, want to develop a drug to cure a disease or to help a disease, right? And so this is in the first place why we need that particular animal to study it.
Right. So my last question, I know you answered this in previous sessions, but for all of our young students who are interested in science, what advice do you have for them going forward?
So whatever interests you in science, whether it is brain science or it is any other science, you know, just follow it. Also try out other things, even if you think, oh, brain science is really the coolest thing you've ever heard about. There is just so much interesting science out. Just really try out as many new things as possible. Try to take opportunities like the one that Ellie has offered you during these past weeks. So try to look for opportunities outside of school. In school, science is often not so interesting during elementary school and middle school. It gets really interesting typically in high school. But you know, you're young students, and if you want to learn about science, you should do it now, and you should, you know, continue doing it. So take opportunities like this one, and there are many, many opportunities out there. So it's not so difficult to find them. There are also, I've mentioned that in my previous sessions with Ellie, a few colleagues of mine and myself, we have founded a free science journal for kids 8 to 14. So that's your age range, basically. You are on that younger end there. It's called Frontiers for Young Minds, and I think Ellie will send you the link. There's a very large science section. So what we do in this journal is that scientists are writing up articles for kids, and this is articles about their own research that they just did, that they just published. And the next thing you know is, you know, you will get an article for our kids journal so that our kids also learn about this, and they learn about it right away as these things get produced. And in this journal, we have now 6 different science sections. So there's also health science, there's earth science. So you should really check it out. There's a lot that you could also kind of explore there. And there will be more, you know, sections added to that as we go. And there are opportunities. There are many, many opportunities like that out there. You just have to really actively seek them out and look for them. And there's a whole world of science that you could already explore at this stage. That would be my recommendation. And you know, once you have found something that you're really you're really passionate about, you really, you know, think about all the time, and you want to learn more, I think just stick to it and really try to learn as much as you can, because that will prepare you, you know, later on when you go to high school, when you go to college, or even for a career as a scientist, if you want to do that. This is just the best preparation, just to learn as much as you can and to enjoy learning about, you know, things that interest you.